Welcome everybody to our festival revisions, Decoding Technological Bias. I am Bettina Wodianke and I am curating the cultural program at the Goethe Institute San Francisco, the cultural institute of the Federal Republic of Germany with a global reach. Good morning in San Francisco, the Bay Area, or wherever you're tuning in the morning, good afternoon or good evening. We are very excited about having you. I am now excited about the third day of our week-long festival revisions today, together with our partners, City Lights, booksellers and publishers, and Grey Area. Grey Area is San Francisco's premier cultural hub, catalyzing creative action for social transformation, applying art and technology to create social and civic impact through education, incubation, and public events. Grey Area's programming seeks to inspire, educate, and facilitate interdisciplinary engagement around important and challenging topics such as technology and society, the environment, and social justice. City Lights, booksellers and publishers is a well-renowned and legendary landmark independent bookstore and publisher that specializes in world literature, the arts, and progressive politics. Inspired by the words of Marshall McLuhan, we become what we behold. We shape our tools and then our tools shape us. We join forces in bringing together a week of discussions, presentations, and workshops that are exploring how technological bias shapes our cultural realities, the role that images play in that context, and what positive actions might look like to strengthen our collective inclusion, diversity, and sustainability. Please visit our respective websites for further information and register for all the upcoming events today and in the course of the next week. There will be many workshops also coming up. We are deeply grateful for that collaboration. I especially want to thank my colleagues in crime, Peter Maravellis, the event director at City Lights, as well as Nadav Hochman, Grey Area's associate director. Thank you for all of your efforts that you have invested into making that festival possible. Our discussions have been a true pleasure and a real enrichment for me. And I also want to thank Matt Chaikin for managing the event in the background. And last but not least, thank you, dear audience, for tuning in. You're always welcome to actively participate in the conversations and to shape them in certain directions by sending us your questions or thoughts via the chat or Q&A function. I am very excited now about our today, or the first discussion of today, and the first presentation by Jonathan Balle with the title Economic Media for the Decolonization of Money. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this event, Gary O'Bannon. Gary O'Bannon joined the University of Missouri, Kansas City's Bloch School of Management in 2012 as an adjunct instructor teaching master's and undergrad human resource management and leadership curriculums. After his retirement as the Director of Human Resources for the City of Kansas City, Missouri in 2019, he began teaching full-time at the Bloch School in January 2020. Currently, Gary moderates UMKC's Critical Conversations, a community-facing series created to address systemic racism. They are available online. Make sure you don't miss out on this series. Please also consider to watch the Journey to Leadership video podcast series featuring interviews with community leaders from the public, private, and non-profit sectors. Gary is the creator and host of that series. He has been a recipient of the Awards of Excellence from the National Public Employer Labor Relations Association, as well as the Local Administrator of the Year Award from the Greater Kansas City chapter of American Society of Public Administrators. In 1994, the Kansas City Globe newspaper cited Gary as one of the 100 most influential African Americans. Gary, thank you so very much for being being here with us. It's such an enrichment having you here. Without further ado, I'm handing now over to you. The screen is all yours.
All right, Bettina, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. 1994, when you say that, wow, how quickly time flies by, right? All right, so as Bettina said earlier, depending on your time zone, I wish you either a great afternoon or a great morning from wherever you may be viewing today's event. I am Gary O'Bannon, Associate Professor at UMKC's Block School of Management, and it is truly my pleasure to host this monumental event and engage with one of the most respected speakers on humanities and media, who I will introduce to you shortly. If you're attending this session, there's probably a good chance that you know or have heard of Jonathan Beller. He is a revered film theorist, culture critic, and mediologist. More specifically, he is a professor of humanities and media studies and the director of the graduate program of media studies at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. He's also a member of the Economic Space Agency think tank, as well as the Social Text Editorial Collective. His work in media studies includes materialistic analysis of cinema, photography, computation, information, and money and finance. His research is concentrated, obviously, in the areas of film and media studies, but also in the areas of critical race and feminist theory and anti-imperialistic and decolonial epistemology and struggle. Now, truly, I would be here for hours if I attempted to list all of the written works of Jonathan Beller, and I won't attempt to do that today, but it is appropriate to mention just a few. I'll draw your attention to the release of his next book, Digitality and Racial Capitalism, Handbook of Marxism. It's scheduled for release this year by Sage Publications. Another one of his works, or in his latest works, is The World Computer, Derivative Conditions of Racial Capitalism. That was a book that was published earlier this year by Duke Press. A recent article, Economic Media, Crypto and the Myth of Total Liquidity, was published in May of last year, and I encourage you to check that out because it's certainly relevant. And his previous books include The Message is Murder, Substrates of Computational Capital. Another is Acquiring Eyes, Philippine Visuality, Nationalistic Struggle, and the World Media System. And one more that I'll mention, The Cinematic Mode of Production, Attention Economy, and the Society of the Spectacle. Again, there are many others, but I'll stop there and I'll graciously ask that you please give Jonathan Beller a soulful visual welcome clap. Now, before I turn it over to Professor Beller, quick rundown on how we plan on managing our time with you today. Professor Beller will speak on today's topic for about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by a handful of questions that I might have for him afterward. We'll close with perhaps the most important part of our time together, which is questions from you, the viewers. So when we get to that point, if you could please place your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box, we promise that we'll do our best to get to as many as possible before we close our discussion about 90 minutes from now. So Professor, before you get going on your formal presentation, I want to ask you, because I love the titles of your articles and your books, what is the process you go through when determining how you name your books or your articles? Now, is it as simple as just trying to capture the essence of your topic, or is there more of a complicated process to that?
Well, thank you, Gary, so much for your really generous and kind introduction. Much appreciated. I will jump into that question as follows. I think of myself as a cultural critic and theorist, and also a writer. And I guess part of my job, as I understand it, is to intervene in the sort of default dispensation of a society which is founded on violence. And in as much as that's true, my titles are an attempt to answer the default function of language with some sort of poetic innovation. Because as I'll be elaborating here a little bit today, colonization is deep. I mean, it is certainly about land and territory and sovereignty, but it's also about representation and language. And our language is so deeply penetrated by power, let me just read it that way, that to innovate in language is actually also to intervene in power formations. And so in certain ways, yeah, I'm just trying to tell it like it is. But in other ways, I'm absolutely trying to innovate words in such a way that they open the imagination, open my imagination, for one, as the person who's got to write the book, but also hopefully my readers. And that's all about dialogue too for me, that this opening creates a space for a potentiality, which I'm very excited to share.
And just one more follow-up. On average, how long does it take for you to complete a book?
It really depends. I mean, certain projects took, 8 or 9 years, partially because of my administrative duties, as the former director of the media studies program at Pratt. More recently, I've taken a little bit of time away from administration, and so I'm working a little more quickly. I have kind of some saved up thinking, which I've been trying to find time to work on, and that's part of my struggle, right? How do I focus enough to do the writing? So the last couple of books, I mean, there's kind of 3 now, have taken a total of about 5-6 years.
And your latest one is coming out when?
Well, the latest one is under review right now from Minnesota Press. It's probably going to be called For the Decolonization of Money, but it might be called Of Communism. I'm actually still thinking about the title. And that one doesn't have a publication date, but probably within the year.
Well, hey, look at that. You've already broken some news. So those who are attending and who heard that get a little bit of a sneak peek as to maybe what that book just might be titled. All right. Well, Professor, thank you for that. Without further delay, audience, Professor Jonathan Beller.
Thanks so much. Again, Gary, thank you. Also, thanks to Bettina, to the Goethe Institute, to City Lights, and to Gray Area. It's really a pleasure to be here. And thanks especially to the audience who's taking time out of their busy schedules to be here now. And as Gary mentioned earlier, after I finish speaking, or even during, if you want, we can have some conversation and comments, questions, and I'll do my best to give provocative, if not satisfying, answers. Today, I'm going to be talking through several ideas. There's kind of a lot of condensed ideas and arguments in this talk. Some are highly condensed, so if things need explication for you, again, feel free to ask towards the end or question what's being said. I'm going to be introducing this concept, economic media, which for me is an emergent media form. It has a history to it, which I'm actually not going to be telling here, but I want to just comment on this aspect of historical formation of cultural form, which is that these things do not sort of emerge ex nihilo. They don't emerge because of the invention of a single person. They're actually, in my view anyway, smelted in struggle. So when you have an emergent media, it's actually answering some of the requisites of power, and also responsive to, and maybe responsible to a certain extent, the needs of people who are undergoing oppression. And one could do very interesting research and work on the history of photography this way, cinema, radio, television, other media. I'm not going to be doing that here today, but I just wanted to mention that this is something to think about. I also wanted to give a kind of a trigger warning. I'm going to be talking about cryptocurrency towards the end of this talk. I want to make sure that it's understood, for me anyway, that I do not believe that I am anything like a Bitcoin maximalist, that I'm not an advocate for cryptocurrency. I'm not here to sell cryptocurrency in any way. I don't believe in technocratic solutions to longstanding social problems, none of those things. But because I see mediation as also sociality and social relations and the materialization of social relations, I'm trying to discuss a potentiality space, which I perceive as emergent. We have a kind of a mutation in political economy and mediation. We're living through that right now. And that affects the way in which semiotics functions, the way in which communication takes place, relations are structured, and social organization becomes possible. So this is sort of the area that I want to enter into today, this notion of economic media, and talk a little bit about the colonization of semiotics in the life world by what I'll be developing under the idea of racial capitalism and computational racial capitalism, and then point sort of towards the end of the talk towards some possible sites of intervention and transformation. Let me share my screen now and take you to it. I'm going to talk through some slides here. So hopefully people can see that. That's the title of my talk.
Looks great.
Great. And let's see. All right. So economic media for the decolonization of money. I want to. There's an idea around which you've probably heard, the financialization of daily life, as Randy Martin said. I'm speaking into the financialization of everyday life. That addresses the colonization of not only the life world, but also practice, social, the psychological, by economic logic and by capital. It implies a kind of optimizing logic, framing almost everything that we do at a certain point, to the point where the qualities of things have been profoundly transformed by the culture of capital and by the realities, the material realities of capital. So implied here is a kind of a subject formation, relationship to risk, aspects of feelings of stress, the kinds of imperceptible but nonetheless real changes which have reorganized our psyches, our subjectivities, and our relationships to one another. The mediations of those things are something I'm going to be talking about today, but some of the effects are kinds of precarity we see. I'm talking about material, but also precarity regarding health. These kinds of objection people experience in relationship to celebrity and social media, this sort of psychological suffering and feeling of erasure, which is so much a part of a world of representation, which is informed by capitalism and the spectacle. Generalized immiseration, the pandemic, which we're still living through, and has the world still in a crisis of really unrepresentable and I think unconceptualizable degree, a kind of pain which is very, very difficult to register. Just on that, I think it's difficult to really come to terms with the fact that it's not a virus that has rendered the world in its current state, that the virus is the tip of an iceberg, which has everything to do with economic security, social protections, healthcare, environmental racism, agribusiness, many of the things which make this pandemic the crisis that it is. It could have been otherwise. Hopefully, there won't be another one, but it's also a wake-up call, and people are waking up, certainly. I don't have to tell you that. Other things which are resultant of this financialization of everyday life, as I understand it, things like climate change, ecocide, climate racism, because the financialization of everyday life, which turns everything into a risk-reward calculation, asks us to also function as individual agents and makes long-term thinking very difficult as we calculate for our own survival on a daily basis. There are all sorts of forms of neocolonialism, the kinds of forced migration that we see globally, in which we're currently a global migration unseen since the end of World War II has been taking place. The rampant racism, certainly we experience in the US, but also in Europe and in many respects around the world, is, I would say, an aspect of this process of financialization and the colonization of the life world by capitalism, the policing, the militarism, and the fascism, which is an extension and an exacerbating factor in and around that racism, and the genocides, which are part and parcel of the current functioning of the world. I have Aimé Césaire in quotation, in parentheses there, because Césaire bitterly remarked about the Holocaust, that the reason Europeans were upset about the Holocaust was not because of what was being done, but because it was being done to the white man. The normalization of genocide as part of the business of, as usual, of capitalism is something that I also wanted to point to, and is one of the things that's underpinning my talk today. So the series that's I'm speaking in is about systemic bias, which I understand as a war on the dispossessed, an ongoing war, which has many, many prongs, and is waged both consciously and unconsciously by people who are signatories to the terms of the social and accept the default functioning of many, many of the technologies which have penetrated the everyday. What it would mean to fight against this, I think, is an open question, but we have many, many examples of struggle to learn from. But we see systemic bias in suffrage and the law. I mean, so much is going on with voting right now in the US, and the biases in the legal system from the history of the United States and elsewhere are quite clear and well documented. We see it in healthcare. We certainly see it in access to housing, in education. We see bias in the press. I call it a war on the dispossessed. I'm thinking about some of the coverage of the first war in Iraq, when the New York Times published a list of the 1,000 people who died in that war. Of course, they were all Americans, right? The Iraqis didn't manifest. They didn't enter into the representation by the press because they were considered to be insignificant. They were thought of as noise. And this kind of filtration system, which is part of the default normativity of our institutions and our machines, is something I really want to point to in this talk. There was a long standing and very important critique of representation in post-structuralism and post-colonial theory, and in many feminisms, which found that Western representation, at the very least, was ethnocentric and phallocentric, meaning to say that it inscribed in a privileged way ethnicity, whiteness, and also masculinity in its default functioning and its organization of meaning, right? So that the very making of meaning was warped by the presence of a presumably white male subject. Similar analysis has taken place with the history of photography. I mean, Lorna Roth has some really important work. There are many others on film stock, showing the history of the development of film stock privileged white skin, and did so for a very long time, and only changed, at least in the Kodak version of this, not because it was Kodak became interested in representing Black and brown people with their film stock, but because the market for furniture and the representation of wood demanded the development of a different sensitivity. The point being that it's market that determined the built-in prejudice of the film stock, not science or not possibility. There's also similar analysis about the inherent and endemic racism in the history of cinema. Someone like Frank B. Wilderson III has analyzed cinema in such a way that that what is represented in mainstream film is a white vision, effectively, and goes so far as to argue that the Black has never appeared in a Hollywood film because overcoded by whiteness, by white imaginary, by white meaning, by white semiotics. I'm going through these because I think it's important to see that in the various domains of the social, people have been decoding and analyzing bias for many years now. And this is part of an ongoing political struggle in which the oppressed have decided that, no, we will not be silenced, we will not be erased, we will not be overcoded by meanings which are invisible, by meanings making system, which, even though it's invisible, continues to operate to our disadvantage. This has been documented in facial recognition software by Joy Bulamwini and Ruha Benjamin, who have said that Bulamwini says explicitly from her own experience that she was not recognized by certain software and kind of left it at that. But then at MIT realized that in fact, this code was being exported all over the world, and that the invisibilization of her face effectively and of dark-skinned people was going to become a default norm in the social. So why is that, right? What is going on in that project? Is it simply because of the technology, or is it because who's making the technology, and also the markets and the default functionality of those markets? There's also been some important criticism about the algorithm. Safia Umoja Nobel's important book, Algorithms of Oppression, in which she begins with a Googling of the search term Black girls, and was shocked to see that the first pages were full of porn, right? While if you Google white girls, you saw middle-class high school kids looking healthy, as if it were the 1950s. So this is these are again, examples of various domains in which bias has been detected and registered and thematized, and is in many cases being overturned, although incompletely for sure. I'm also suggesting here that we can see similar things in information, and that information is in fact not a natural phenomenon, but occurs as a result of the imposition of exchange value on the life world. So that's a longer discussion. I may not be able to make that argument in its entirety, but in situating the idea of information historically, rather than saying that it's an ontological structure, I'm also saying that information itself as a thing, but also as a way of treating the world, contains many of the biases that we've seen in these other media forms. In fact, in underpinning these other media forms, it absorbs many of these biases and operationalizes them. So these are some of the thinkers who are kind of behind what I'm discussing here. I can only take I'm very grateful to these people, these writers and thinkers. I've learned tremendously from them. I'm not saying that I'm representing them or their work adequately, but I've borrowed certain things to the best of my ability to inform the discussion that I'm trying to launch here. So racial capitalism, settler colonialism, white supremacist heteropatriarchy, these are forms which are resultant of, in my view anyway, of the history of capitalism. I'll go through some of the key points here, maybe not all of them, because this is taking a little bit longer than I expected, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. Cedric Robinson's really significant book, Black Marxism, argues that racism is civilizational, and that race and racialization is a fundamental part of the history of capitalism. That capitalism doesn't evolve as some kind of abstract system of values with profits and wages, but in fact requires race as a category which allows to discount certain populations in order that they be ultra exploited. So I was particularly interested in the Black Atlantic and the history of Black people planet-wide. But he goes through, 13th and 14th century European early capitalist societies as well. Mentions that the Slavs are the original slaves, and that this process of racialization, which licensed kind of an ultra-violence towards entire populations, is part and parcel of what capitalism is and how it develops. Stuart Hall and Simone Brown's work, among others, on epidermalization is also really important here. Hall says race is the modality in which class is lived, while epidermalization implies a kind of writing on the body, which is obviously an extremely violent process. So branding is one of the things that Simone Brown talks about, but all the various humiliations and forms of violent inscription, large and small, individual and collective, from physical abuse to press representation to photography, are part of this process of epidermalization, this kind of encoding of bodies by a social logic. This is also very important in my understanding of racial capitalism and what I call computational racial capitalism. Excuse me. The project of colonialism and settler colonialism is also key here. Patrick Wolf says that colonialism is a structure, not an event. I think it's an important reminder. Colonialism didn't just happen once, it's an ongoing process. And settler colonialism is still being waged today in the erasure and of indigenous histories and indigenous subjectivity, indigenous cultural forms, indigenous expression, indigenous sovereignty, indigenous rights to the land. This is not just a one-time thing, it's a structure which is continually ratified down to the present. I've also been reading with great interest and learning tremendous amount from Leanne Bettis and Asoke Simpson. who speaks about indigenous people having thousands of years of experience outside of capitalism and also hundreds of years inside of capitalism. And and for me anyway, it gives a really important sense of the possibility of collectivity and mutual aid. It still persists, it still is here with us. Silvia Federici's notion of woman as a historical category of political economy, that is something that political economy invented and inscribed in order to extract free labor from a whole genre of people. Angela Davis's notion of the erasure of historical work and agency of Black women and women, race, and class. Jasper Poor's notion of maiming and the right to maim and impose disability as part of what the capitalist state is capable of doing and is doing all the time in order to capacitate some subjects and incapacitate others. Importantly here also is a refusal in Poor's work of neoliberal solutions, meaning to say that the solutions, in her view, or such that they might be, are not, as I understand it, are not to sort of enfranchise yet another group of different kinds of people and give a larger slice of the neoliberal pie if it doesn't understand, if that enfranchisement doesn't address the systemic violation and dispossession, which is part and parcel of global capitalism. I mean, 2 billion people live on $2 a day, right? That is not an accident. That's not a given condition. That is actually a creation of the history of capitalism, that radical dispossession of life and future by the deep infrastructure and relations of our society. So we can say that racial capitalism is a violent extractive system of violent extractive systems functioning on the historical production of social differences. It is the for-profit elaboration, codification, institutionalization, and inscription of difference as the basis of value production. This slide takes the phrase information, a difference that makes a social difference, which is my revision of Gregory Bateson's notion that information is a difference that makes a difference. I insert social there because I think it's important to remember that the social is always operative in thinking. It's nice to imagine that we could do without it. And the notion, Nietzsche's critique of science, which he accuses of having an aesthetic ideal, I think is relevant here. In the aesthetic ideal, we can imagine a world without us, right? That exists without our accompanying thought. And yet this is a fantasy, right? I mean, this is a fantasy which is, Donna Haraway calls the God trick, something that's quite dangerous because it disappears history and privilege. So to summarize and indeed integrate the previous slide, we might say that racial capitalism functions through the creation and operationalization of a system of social differences and differentiation for the purposes of value extraction, that is exploitation and expropriation. This hierarchical system exacerbates differences and thrives on oppression. This is fundamental to what it is. These differences, formal and informal, legal, scriptural, ideological, cultural, material, representational, photographic, cinematic, phenotypic, scientific, computational, etc., are operationalized as part of a global financial system. Race, gender, caste, nation, religion, sexuality, body type, geography, etc., and used to assign or impose value or price. Right? This violent constitution underpins the form of value and whiteness. So what I'm saying is that this global process of social differentiation and the institutions which enforce the meaning of those differences are also the institutions which maintain our economy. And that what we take as the value form in capital, which is seemingly without qualities, right? I mean, it's just pure quantity, $5, right? It's 5 or 10 or 20 or 10,000 or 10 billion. These things that seem like they're pure quantities are actually vertically integrated with all the qualities and qualifications that I've been discussing so far. And that's what's disappeared in the value form, right? That whole process by which it has emerged simultaneously, that's also disappeared in information. So this violent constitution, which I'm describing, underpins the value form and also whiteness, right? Which is the race of no race, presumably the universal subject. So if you hear me saying that whiteness is founded on violence and on a history of violence, then you're hearing me correctly. Information like value and whiteness is a historical category inseparable from racial capitalism. Social difference in terms of qualities are codified and imposed by hegemony because composed as a calculus of value. I'm thinking about Cedric Robinson here, right? Racism, civilization is racializing. And this process of racialization is fundamental to the extraction of value and the maintenance of the financial system. So we could ask, what price servitude? How much do people pay for domestic labor, right? What price murder? What price genocide? What price whiteness? We are living in a world of discounted people who must now reorganize for liberation. For me, this description of racial capitalism, when married, forgive the metaphor, to computation, gives us computational racial capitalism, or what I also think of sometimes as the derivative condition. Generalized organization and enforcement of difference by means of vertical and horizontal information management, including risk management. That's one of the characteristics. These are politics, the state, advertising, finance. These are all ways of managing risk. And if you think about it, when a country decides to, as a matter of policy, to call a group of people terrorist, right? That is a political wager, but it's also a financial one. It also allows for certain activities to be conducted, certain weapons to be sold, certain policy goals, certain internal agencies to activate their legitimacy. Every kind of semiotic gesture at the level of state making, but also advertising and finance is related to process of capitalization. What you have also with this is the background monetization of semiotic and cognitive linguistic activity. So not only at the state level, which may be a little bit more abstract and difficult to see in an instant, but certainly at the level of something like internet relations and the way in which the computation functions more generally, we see that this creation of information or meaning in these systems, think about Facebook, for example, produces value for someone, right, if not for us. And this process of collecting the fruits of semiotic efforts in a leveraged way is also something that I see as central to the pyramidal structure of computational racial capitalism. The media infrastructure is effectively fixed capital, and this is what I argued in The Message is Murder. We could try to communicate whatever we want, and even if our values are anti-capitalist, even as I speak to you here about the possibilities of some future or present revolutions, there is in the background a system which is capturing my semiotic output and your cognitive relation to me in order to maximize a profit from it, right? Though we could go into the details of how that's taken up in the Q&A if you want, but effectively something like Facebook and Google delivers value to shareholders. How does it do that? It does that by collapsing the qualities of our messaging into abstract quantities that are money. So there are other sort of important history here of this kind of capturing of the cognitive linguistic and the semiotic. I read about attention economy in the semiotic, in the cinematic mode of production, in which the screen becomes a privileged interface with capital, where screen labor, which at the time was doubted by everyone and thought to be impossible, but where screen labor actually means that we take our subjective time and our attention, bind it to technology in a certain way that can be capitalized and is capitalized. And the film industry was not just a subroutine kind of entertainment around industrial capital, but was increasingly becoming the dominant, such that slowly our world became organized by screens and by screen labor, or what I sometimes call informatic labor. Informatic labor is the development of metrics to convert work, attention, geolocation, metabolism into information. Information is absorbed as state changes on computers, and A becomes part of fixed capital, and B becomes a derivative contract on future social action, algorithms that one can bet on. And this is kind of the next level here, that the conversion of sociality into information creates a surface that's receptive to financialization. People can bet on one form or another and do their risk management accordingly by basically betting on certain kinds of social outcomes, which are translated to information and feedback with information. The information capture providing the returns. In some, I guess, we have a codification of bodies and peoples and a tranching of social difference, which is part of what techno-capitalist racism looks like. We also have, and this is just a kind of a footnote, a shift in the way in which capital validates itself. Marx's version was that money becomes commodity, becomes more money, right? Money prime. And it was the process of labor and the dissymmetrical exchange of the wage that produced more value for capitalism. That's how you turn money into more money. What I'm suggesting here, and I argue this in the World Computer, is that the commodity is can be better understood as information. That money becomes information, becomes M prime. That's a longer story, but I just wanted to put it out there for people who might be interested. What we have as a result of all this is a financialization of expression. We can see this in the failure of the internet to democratize. I mean, the internet horizontalized communication, but without remaking the pyramidal and extractive economic logic. In fact, it's become the major engine for profit. So how can the collective effervescence of communicative potential, which should mean something like democracy and transsubjectivity and world transformation, turn into greater profits for 5 or 10 billionaires who have more wealth than half the planet? So the digital revolution, we could say, was a failed revolution. I think of it as an example of Caesarism, which was Gramsci's code word for fascism. And in fact, after the failure of the digital revolution, we could say that we've entered into a period in which the world is increasingly characterized by fascism once again. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, when 45 was president, 6 or 7 of the major world powers were led by leaders who were effectively fascists. I mean, the definitions, one could parse the definition a little bit, but, and I don't want to go too deeply into this right now, but the idea that one person accumulates the agency of many and then stands in for their agency completely follows the celebrity system, in which mass expression is converted into a single agency, and while property relations remain the same. The current crisis, the Anthropocene, so-called, is the result of financialized world communication, platformed on proprietary information systems that are a result of and secured by the institutionalized and networked inequalities of racial capitalism, which is to say that because of the structure of communications and value, we can't make decisions which are beneficial to the planet. Only these optimizing decisions for individual capitals at war with one another are the kinds of decisions that get made. But collectivist decisions for the benefit of all becomes structurally impossible. Even thinking in those kinds of timeframes becomes incredibly difficult because of the way our communicational system is financialized. And I think you can see here why I'm moving towards this idea of economic media. Politically, we can stand the situation on its head by recognizing that finance is an expressive medium, but what is it expressing right now? Right now, there's an expression of the logistics and volatility of racial capitalism, in which all activity is formatted as investable subroutines of that relentless and seemingly global project. So finance has been a dirty word, and it should be. I mean, it's like money. These are words which express an unbelievably extractive set of processes. What I'm wondering here, and this is my kind of writing experiment, the thought experiment I've been conducting for a while, is can we propose a notion of radical finance working towards, let's just say, the transition to communism? And that's a shorthand. What would such a decolonial reversal demand? Nothing less than the redesign of the financial architectures that currently network forms of sociality with extractivist media. Google, Facebook, national monies, the banking systems, property law, carceral systems, racial oppression, the denial of indigenous rights, the war against women and queers, in short, the protocols of racial capitalism. And this word protocols is very important to me because what we see is that there are these procedural aspects of the social, which are formally and informally encoded, and that the monetary system and the communication system depends upon the continuity among those protocols. So money is a medium and money is a set of protocols. Monetary media are not pure quantities, but carry messages. I think this is a kind of an important part of what I'm getting at here. I gestured to this notion that money is pure quantity, right? I mean, that it's almost scalar, 5, 10, 100, 1,000, million, but it's also denominated or carries with it a denomination. So for example, dollars, which I'm suggesting has a message. What that message is may be quite general, but what it means is that when you hold US dollars, you're also holding stake in the nation state, the United States, and same for other national currencies. And the shifting values, the volatility among these currencies on currency markets means that the futures of these nation states and their hegemony, their management, their returns, their stability are constantly under query, right, and in doubt. And so that each of these monies, which seems to express itself in pure quantities, also carries with the qualities of its individual nation. This will be important later when we get into crypto a little bit and talk about things like Bitcoin, which is also a very limited messaging system. I mean, the same way that dollars can only, within the dollar system, you can communicate 1, 10, or 100, right? But you're still saying US dollars. Bitcoin is similar. You can communicate portions of Bitcoins, but you also are communicating something about the Bitcoin narrative when you use it or when you don't use it. Ledgers, this is an important aspect of where I'm going. What we would really think of as money, dollar bill, is an interface with a vast system of accounts, right? I mean, rather than thinking that money as an object, if we think about it as an interface with a system, then we start to see it as a medium in an important way. Issuance, another key aspect of money, which we can actually rethink. One of the protocols of money, which might be up for redesign and decolonization. Perry Marilling has this idea of the money view, where he shows that banks following the US model are actually issuers of money in a hierarchy of money and credit, in which the highest money comes from the central bank. So the central bank has the best money, the national banks have pretty good money, down to the credit cards, which have less money, and the money that you get from the credit cards issue to you when you spend costs you a lot because it's higher risk. And so the interest rates are high. This is the money view that Marilling talks about. But the key thing there is that often we think that money just comes from one central place. But in fact, there are in the network of monetary systems, issuers of money. The news, I suppose, is that you and I cannot be issuers of money, right? I mean, at least that has not been possible. We've required states until recently. In the history of money, it's more complex, but kind of what works now is states in a charterless system of issuance, in which one pays taxes and pays armies with national currencies. The idea of legal tender is part of that. The further down the hierarchy, one is the more expensive is credit, and thus the more expensive is money. So those of us with less money pay more for our money. Some of us pay most of our life for money. Integration with colonization of the fabric of life. So this is something else that the monetary medium has done. It's transformed the character of space, the character of time, the qualities of the psyche, our sense of identity, proprioception, where and what our bodies is, our ideas of the future. This is also part of the financialization of life and the operations of the protocols of money. I mean, this is a deep transformation, which goes kind of beyond the resolution of self-inquiry, right? You can sort of think into your mind, you can sort of think into language very, very deeply. And I would say that you still wouldn't hit the limits of its transformation by the history of capitalism, of racial capitalism. That these things are operative all the way down, right? And are kind of at the bottom of epistemological questions. So time, right? I mean, we think about time as being just this thing that anybody can experience, but somebody like Moshe Postone has shown, following the work of Lukács and others, that capitalism and industrialization changes the character of time. That time was a dependent variable early on. It had to do with when the sun came up, when it went down, when people did certain things, change with the seasons. It became an independent variable when it became a measure of wage labor and therefore of value, where you had trains had to run on time. This is the Goethe Institute. Trains had to run on time, but also the work day, the measure of the wage, hours or days, whatever it was. You had a global standardization of time, which slowly has captured planetary time. This is one of the transformations I'm talking about. Similarly, with that time also, of course, you get modern physics. So one could make sort of similar forays into any of the terms listed here. But what if we remake the monetary protocols? What if we can reformat the institutions that hold them in place by organizing ourselves differently in accord with the protocols of liberation from oppression? This is where I get into cryptocurrency and economic media a little bit. Again, I want to make it clear that I don't think Bitcoin is the revolution, please. It's not by any means. I think what's important about it is that, like photography, cinema, television, and digital media, it signals a transformation in media ecology, in political economy, and global organization. It announces the emergence of a new medium. And in case that doesn't make sense immediately, I mean, if you think about the introduction of writing and its capacity of archivization, right, it actually changes species capacities. Maybe not all for the good, but certainly changes them, where you can actually remember things. You can go back to the past in a way with a written record. It linearizes thinking by putting it on the line. It creates the kind of temporality that we're talking about, arguably. It changes human potential profoundly. With cinema, Pasolini called it the written language of reality, right? So suddenly suggesting that, like, with a film archive, with the visual, you could actually record the visual the way in which writing could record speech. And that would create a huge set of transformations and a new set of possibilities. Those of you who are just interested in cultural analysis, I'm sure are aware of this and thinking in this mode. So I'm suggesting that crypto is a new medium of kind of this caliber, right? That it's actually bringing together various, constellating various historical vectors in a new way. And that this is a space full of danger, but also a space of potential. Full financialization means that in capitalism, practically all media functions as economic media, that is extractively. So music, right? Maybe we listen on audio cassettes, now we download it, or we listen to it we stream it on our computers. These are becoming extractive algorithms. At the same time, we see that monetary media express values platformed on organized systems, as I was saying with the US dollar. This convergence of media forms is the real meaning of convergence when the term is used to describe the absorption of prior media by computation. I mean, we had analog media, which have been slowly digitized. Effectively now, we access almost everything on our computers. By we, I'm speaking about the global north, but not only. That's a longer discussion, but I just wanted to footnote that. The absorption of media by financialized information says that all media have become digital economic media organized by a virtual machine, that kind of total system or AI that I've been speaking about, what I sometimes call the world computer. To sustainably change social relations, we must also reprogram this virtual machine. So that's, to me, one of the salient political questions of our time. How do we do that? We might do this by reprotocolizing economic media, by occupying and decolonizing the convergence of computation and money. Crypto shows that this occupation is possible. But what about decolonization and the end of extractivist mediation? So when I say that crypto shows that this occupation is possible, what we've seen is that, you know, these new forms of money making and monetary mediation, not platformed on nation states, are beginning to displace national monies in very interesting ways. As I said, the jury is out on what that means. I have other comments I could make about that later. But what it shows is that there is a desire to exceed the capacities and to transcend the capacities of national money. again, not all that desire is progressive. I mean, there's a libertarian aspect to this, which is most objectionable in my view. But the possibility of transforming the protocols of money, of occupying the space of money and doing something with it by recognizing it as a set of codes and protocols that can then be decoded, cracked, and remade, to me, is one of the ways in which we might break the stranglehold of computational racial capitalism. So some of the things that I'm thinking about and seeing is that is this idea of platform cooperatives and the possibilities of something like platform communism. Again, I'm using communism as a shorthand here. I'm not sure if anyone knows what it means, but I have a sense of where it's going. So crypto is no more the revolution than was photography, cinema, or the internet. Again, these opened up potentiality spaces which were dialectical, they opened up realms of freedom and also new forms of foreclosure and capture. I think crypto is similar. The outcome for crypto is not a matter of contemplation, right? It's actually a matter of recognizing that this is a sea change in social relations and requires intervention from the progressive forces in history in order to transform that outcome and take control of that outcome or those outcomes. By reprotocolizing ledgers, issuance, network architecture, we might create money forms that value activities and relations in terms of our own making. That is, we decide what counts as value and what's valuable, rather than letting the world market, which is founded on functions through and as racial capitalism. We might create money forms, economic media, capable of cultivating qualities that persist in the substrate, in the system of accounts and accountability. We might also be able to value care, ecology, mutual aid, pluriversal practices, anti-racist organizing, queer and other progressive social movements in their own terms, rather than in those imposed by racial capitalism's value form, the form that either externalizes the global majority's real concerns or otherwise discounts them. And when we value things in the global form, we're actually allowing the default institutionalization of oppression decide what value is. It's possible to displace that. I'm not saying overturn it, by a single individual or even a small group, but it is possible to suspend and displace that system of valuation in order to create new forms of organization. We might create economic media with issuance capacities that accord with our sense of community. Say, for example, where everybody could issue money, where we work with a system of mutual credit, with value recognition and temporal aspects, currency that concurs with our historical aspirations. We might imagine a world in which allied groups could write their own futures on an expressive economic substrate, right? That's what a future is. It's a prediction about an outcome. But who writes those? Right now, the financial systems, the financial institutions only. What if we also could write futures and wager on them? Well, I mean, politics is risk, right? Waging a revolution is also a risk. Fighting for social change is risk. We risk we risk not doing it, but we also risk doing it. I think it's important to recognize that this aspect of risk in the political is a fundamental component. We might imagine creating distributed cooperatives, that is, systems of network cooperation, who create their own currencies and set their own terms of valuation. And we might imagine a cooperative of allied cooperatives organized so that internally there is little to no value extraction. That is, people participate in a mutually recognized voluntary mode, and such that all participants have equity in the platforms that they contribute to and indeed create. So unlike when you're working on Facebook, you don't just produce value for somebody else, you actually end up having an equity stake in the platform that you make with others. Activists in post-capitalist economies. So that's, I guess, what I'm thinking about. I mean, how could we build those things? The Silicon Valley crypto bros are not going to do it for us. The close cousins, neoliberalism and fascism, are not going to do it for us. Right? These are not solutions. And these are not the people who are going to solve the questions that we're asking. We could imagine democratizing and collectivizing financial tools and new financial literacies. Right? What would it mean to sort of transform the financial imaginary and imagine that we ourselves, who are members of various communities and struggle, are the ones who are going to reorganize our economic practices, our economic participation, in such a way that we could foster solidarity among and with the oppressed, engage in mutual aid, and have the capacity to value forms of care, life-making, sustainability, and ecology. There has to be, I would say, a spirit of experimentation. With mutual credit, there are many ways to think about this, and there's been a lot of interesting work on it, peer-to-peer or friend-to-friend or distributed forms of mutual credit. In the Philippines right now, without any tech at all, something in response to the Duterte regime and the COVID pandemic has emerged called the community pantry, which is really each according to their ability, each according to their need, effectively. People bring what they have to offer to the community pantry and take what they need in order to make it to the next day. And this is sort of a spontaneous emergence of people's practice, you know, in an economy and in sharing, which no state is organized. But the state is, interestingly and frighteningly, cracking down because they feel like it's communist. Organization of cooperation and value creation. So this is another, I think, really important area. I mean, how can we work together to create value in non-extractive ways? In the crypto space, there are these things called DAOs. Some of them are not interesting. Some of them, I think, are a little bit more interesting. Distributed autonomous organizations in which people can co-create and share equity in their projects. If this sounds like a lot like capitalist finance, it still actually is. But the interesting thing is it might be possible to, within certain spaces, create non-extractive, mutually supportive relations and still interface with the market. I mean, this is frankly what I'm seeing as a key strategy right now. None of us are going to fully escape the market tomorrow, right? But we may begin to cultivate spaces of conviviality in which the value creation and the sharing feels better. It's actually better to be in these spaces, to work with the people who are going to respect us, to recognize us, and transform our sensibilities together, right? So this sort of idea of a cooperative and a distributed cooperative seems to me to be a key part of the imaginary here. Again, the notion of having equity in any platform where the platform is not extractive, but because it's built on the activity of participants, it's shared by participants. What you might have if you have this increasing cooperation among cooperatives is you have an increasingly large space of convivial economy, which exists in tension with capitalism, but actually opens a spread on capitalism. Gives people a chance to bet between the future of racial capitalism, for example, and the future of these cooperatives or platform communist endeavors. What if I want to put more of my money, more of my life, more of my being into the place that feels good, right? The place that actually cares about the environment, values other people, is not racist, you know, it's not homophobic. What if these are the spaces that I want to work in, the people I want to work with? How can we sort of make our economies and partition them in such a way that they can be supported, become sustainable, and grow stronger? That spread is a really interesting space, I think, because it shows that there is a alternative financial system that we could actually create. There's more there, but I just wanted to mention this idea. And finally, I think this is my last phrase in this talk, which maybe got a little long, sorry, is that we might create futures that are written from below, right? I mean, at present, as I said, the financial system is the one that's writing our futures, and their architectures are simply about outcomes within the space of capitalism. But if we could issue, I skipped one point here, this idea of social derivatives and qualitative derivatives. If we can write derivatives with qualities, if we can wager on particular practices and particular outcomes that are specific and qualified because they represent the qualitative dimension of value recognized by a community of practitioners, then we have a different kind of economic arrangement. We have a different kind of economic engine. All this is quite speculative, I know, and somewhat abstract. And yet I feel, like I said, as a writer and as a cultural theorist, these are important spaces to occupy. These are really important spaces of the imagination and for critique and for practice, which if we fail to address, will do what all the other media before it have done ultimately, that has become purely extractive technologies. So this is I guess, a preamble to struggle. Right.
Well, Professor, you are taking my brain to a whole new level that I didn't even realize existed, and I thank you for that. We need more thought leaders like you, particularly in these challenging times that we face. I want to tip off to the audience that now is the time that if you have questions for Professor Beller, please consider entering them now in the Q&A box, or at least in the next few minutes so that we can maximize the time that we have together. In the meantime, I do have a few follow-up questions for the professor. Professor, how did you arrive at the idea of economic media, and is this in itself a media theory of money?
Well, I mean, yes, thanks. I think my work on cinema early on made me realize that the spaces that we thought of as non-monetary actually had a deep function and internal organization, which was ordained by capitalist society and capitalist value abstraction. And so what that meant for me, like I was looking at revolutionary cinema in the Soviet Union and seeing the way in which Eisenstein in particular, but there are many other filmmakers, including Siga Vertov, saw that by showing different things to a population, you could re-engineer, in his view, their psyches, actually remake their sensibilities such that they could become part of the revolutionary class. This was an avant-gardist notion of revolution to which I don't entirely subscribe, but at the same time, it showed the productive aspect of film, right? It showed that film was actually a machine for the production and transformation of society. When I recognized that, that's what some of these revolutionary filmmakers were doing, also with third cinema, mostly in Latin America, the other side of it also appeared to me that in fact, cinema was a machine of extraction. It was actually capturing people's attention, and therefore was already, I didn't call it this at the time, was already an economic medium, right? It was it seemed like it was a medium of communication. Behind it, there was an economic architecture. More so with the internet, right? I mean, the internet became clear, which you had advertisers like, searching for eyeballs effectively and selling their clicks based upon how many eyeballs they could deliver. And those eyeballs could be qualified too. What kind of eyeballs? Whose eyeballs? So this whole process made me more aware that the internet too was an economic medium, a for-profit practice. What was missing in my own thinking was that money was also a communication system. I've only recently sort of turned to this line of thinking, but that money also communicates, but we think it communicates only in quantities, right? What's my bank balance? But because we also know that money, and there was a lack thereof, structures people's experiences so profoundly, their desires, their aspirations, the way they relate to one another, what's possible for them. You also know that money mediates between the social and the cultural and these quantities. So what I've seen coming together, and what I think Bitcoin was really important in this, was that these things were becoming one substrate, effectively, or they were tending towards one substrate. So that something like Bitcoin, which was a communications medium, like the internet in a way, although very limited because it could just go more or less, 5 or 3, also expressed qualities, and that we could make the qualities of money more robust, but also control the kinds of qualities which are expressed. This possibility of authoring the qualities of money, to me, resonates with what the internet offered, which was that anyone could express themselves, right? Anyone could express themselves. But the problem with the internet, as I said in my talk, is that you couldn't change the financial architecture. Say what you want, Mark Zuckerberg is going to make $1 billion. Right, and that's how it is. We can we can denounce them all we want, but that's just going to make more money for the shareholders of these media companies. Economic media allows us to also change the protocols of value creation and value distribution that underpin expression. And to me, that is like a really important space of intervention.
Now, nearly every foundation here in America, unfortunately, was built on systemic racism. And you mentioned several: housing, education, finance. And by the way, I love your phrase, finance is a dirty word, and it should be. It's money. I love that. I actually wrote that down. But explain how money itself is racist.
Well, I mean, what I was trying to get at, I mean, I should be a little more specific, maybe. I mean, modern monies, I think is what I really mean. And money, which is part of the system of racial capitalism that I described, What I was trying to get across, and it's difficult even for me, who's like trying to like express this stuff to think this all at once, is that you have this vertical integration of all these racist institutions, which have benefited from basically rolling over the debt on reparations, right? Not paying reparations, not addressing historical atrocities and historical violences, but capitalized on it. And I'm looking for the right word. What's the word when you turn over a loan again and again and it becomes more money? Compounds.
Yeah.
Compounding the debt on justice, right? That is that system of value, which has compounded the debt on injustice, is what informs money. That's what money is, actually. Money is like something that we'll spend in a society where all of that is legit. And so what I'm trying to say when I say money is racist, right, which I guess is probably too reductive of me to put it that way, is that when you spend in contemporary society, you're validating the structures of racial capitalism. You can't help it. It's kind of like what the one's saying about the internet, right? You're speaking on the internet, we're communicating, but we're also making money for these shareholders. If we save our money in US dollars, we're making the US system stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I tell you what, I'm going to deviate from the process that I said earlier. We were going to engage a professor, and then I was going to open it up to questions. But as questions come in, I want to be sure, because sometimes when we do these webinars, we always run out of time and we don't have enough time to get all of the audience questions in. So I'm going to insert a couple that we have already. And the first one is from an anonymous attendee, and perhaps everybody is going to come across as anonymous. But could you expand on your framing of NFTs in relation to it being a medium? This is a very topical, timely question.
Yeah,
money being made, right?
That's a great question. So NFT stands for, at least now it stands for non-fungible token. And it's the most common form is on Ethereum, the ERC 721 token, although there are innovations in this. What's interesting about that is it allows you to put a non-fungible token, which is indexed to a particular quality on the blockchain, right? Which is the technical substrate for a lot of these cryptocurrencies. Without going too deep in that direction, that allows you to put qualities on a monetary substrate, right? So if I have a painting and I make issue an NFT, this non-fungible token indexed to that painting, then all of a sudden this qualitative form exists in this medium, which is primarily monetary, but in the expanded sense that I was saying. That in itself is not that interesting to me, because it's part of the whole logic of fetishism around the art markets, where, you know, Picasso can be worth more than the life of an entire village, or, you know, even a small town, because of the accumulation of capital and the tastes of the wealthy. But what's interesting about the NFT as a form is that it also allows for organization underneath and kind of fractional ownership. So people could issue an NFT and work as a cooperative under the sign of an NFT. An NFT could be assigned to a particular quality, you know, whether it was like a beach cleanup, or whether it was a prison abolition in a particular place. You could have issue the NFT around a quality, and then organize a cooperative underneath that NFT, and where the returns were shared and awarded by systems of our own devising, effectively, where we could recognize one another's contributions to our activist project and share the meaning of that NFT. Now, what's the market going to do with that? That's a very interesting question, but it's also kind of an exciting question, because it allows people to actually support these activist projects who might not have access to otherwise. So you open up a new sort of design space and sociality space with the NFT. That's not happening yet, but I think it might. One more comment here is that some of these things aren't going to happen unless we make them happen. You know, I mean, that's the other thing. We need to be very active about this technology. We need to understand it, and we need to move to make it deliver the things that we need.
Now, there's a second part to the question too. Is this just reinforcing the same systems that you've been speaking about, still talking about the NFTs?
Well, in the first way that I spoke about it, yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think it's just basically feeding the art market and art fetishism. And in fact, you know, cynically, it even intensifies and accelerates some of the things that are happening in the art market, where the only meaning of art is money. right? I mean, when you think about the collapse, a lot of people are investing in art, not because they actually, maybe they like it on their wall and they get some social capital out of the fact that their friends can see it when they have it. But it's purely investment. And in fact, a lot of artists, you probably know, is bought and containered and not even looked at and then sold later to some other investor. So that aspect of the NFT and of art fetishism, I think, is absolutely simultaneously typical of the capitalist economy and also completely reprehensible, because it asks us to imagine that creativity and creative expression exists only for one purpose, which is to serve existing forms of wealth.
All right, another question coming in, and I hope they don't mind me mentioning their name. This is from Ramla. I'm sorry, Ramla. They appreciate your talk and ask whether or not you could address the ecological cost of mining Bitcoin and what an alternative might look like.
Yeah, great question. It's something that's really been haunting my own thinking. You know, I have two different points of view on this. The first is that Bitcoin's ecological cost is absolutely awful. I mean, I think it's like with the 35th largest country or something in terms of the amount of energy usage it requires. On the other hand, it's probably less energy than something like other national currencies require to support, especially if you think about their banking system, their ATMs for sure, but also how much their military industrial complexes cost in order to support those currencies, right? So if you think about the nation state as a whole, and that's why a media systemic approach to money, I think, is very useful. If we see the entire system as being integrated, then we could recognize that the energy costs in these other systems is also extremely high. But all that said, it's no excuse for Bitcoin's use of energy. I mean, intellectually, it's understandable because it was a way of securing the network, making it too expensive to attack. But there are a lot of innovations there, including proof of stake against proof of work, which changed the protocols and could reduce the energy usage by a factor of 1,000, I've read. So certainly I would support those kinds of processes, and I think that's going to be the future. What happens to Bitcoin, you know, who knows? Again, like I said, it's not, even though it's a landmark shift in the way in which economic media deploys, it's not the revolution.
And you may have touched on this response, but I'm going to go ahead and ask the question anyway. Would a global reserve currency like a crypto outside of government control be a net positive for the developing world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that I find hard to answer, because certainly the US dollar is not a net positive for the developing world. A single currency as a global reserve currency, I mean, that would be Bitcoin, right? That's what people are talking about. That's a game theory kind of thing. For some people, it would be a good thing, I think. For others, less good. I mean, states like the United States and China would probably resist that if that became a serious possibility. A net good, I mean, I don't know. I don't think I have a good answer to that. But I just want to say that the kind of thing I'm talking about today was not about a global reserve currency as much as about the possibility of communities issuing their own currencies, right? And that communities could create currencies which were valid within their networks, but actually extend their networks and make them interoperable with one another, so that it would be possible to make currency agreements effectively, or value agreements, so that local currencies in one egalitarian network could also spend in others. The math there and the coding is not trivial, but that would be the idea, that we could have many expressive monies, right? Which had persistent qualitative values and didn't sort of fall back into a single currency with one meaning.
Okay, so I'm going to push you back global just one more time. Okay, so
yeah.
You sound confident that crypto is not the future of some sort of universal monetary exchange. Is it possible to surmise with some reasonable certainty which form of money may be the most dominant in, say, the next couple of decades?
Well, I do think that computationally platform monies are here to stay. I mean, I think that, so I'm not sort of like saying crypto's done. I'm just seeing a spectrum of outcomes possible from the technology. I mean, the same way that we could say that photography, for example, was used for surveillance and for the inscription of racism, and therefore exacerbated certain forms of social inequality. Or we could say that photography and family albums and other kinds of portraiture actually recorded histories that would have otherwise been lost and were really important cultural spaces of cultural preservation, and now spaces of active reclamation and transformation. I mean, there's those two dimensions. I'm seeing that in crypto. I'm seeing sort of like the computationalization of money and the computational platforming of money opens up these new spaces. I mean, if China's version, or probably the US version, or Facebook's version prevails, then you'll have a kind of surveillance technology built into money, where everything that you spend it on will be known. Your accounts can be turned off at will by a central authority. That kind of really dystopian, even more dystopian possibility opens up. However, if we have these monies which are computationally platformed and cryptographically secured and local and sustained by communities which care about one another and whose social bonds are more important or as important as what we think of as their financial bonds, then we'll have a different outcome. And that's kind of the potentiality space I'm talking about. So I wouldn't want to just like predict, right? For me, like the cultural questions are really matters of activism. It's like, what future are we going to help make happen?
Professor, I'm going to draw your attention to the Q&A because I want to be sure I read the question correctly, because maybe the way they have worded it is really meaningful. Where would one place the counterfeit within decolonization?
I would love for that questioner to say a little bit more about that question if they would.
Yeah, well, and that's the way that struck me too. So I will call that out. They are going to expand. So I think they will be in the process of typing that. While they're doing that, follow up, can you give some examples of endeavors to remake monetary media, to redesign what people think of as money?
Yeah, I can. I've been working for a long time with a group of people who have been trying to do that. Trying to imagine a peer-to-peer system, or really a friend-to-friend mutual credit system in which anyone can be an issuer, right? And that anyone can issue credit. And when you give credit to someone, you're also giving them credit in your whole network. So as people reach friend-to-friend agreements, they open their networks to one another. And that becomes a network in which transaction space is possible. So that's kind of one idea. There are others. I'm also thinking about this structure of the NFT and the way in which it would be possible to have something like an affectometer, in which the network could register its sense of what part of the network needs funding through an interface as simple as touch, perhaps, spending time dwelling on particular places in the network that need more fuel or more finance. And you can drip funds that way to people or activities that need funding. I'm also working with a group in the Philippines right now, which is a super interesting, I'm not sure how far this is going to go, it's at the very preliminary stages, but we're talking about the possibility of creating effectively a token which gives access to community and a basic income through various contributions and the various activities that people are doing all the time anyway. But creating a solidarity network which has a treasury which is fed through voluntary contribution but trickles to everybody, which would allow for an overcoming of some of the class inequality which is still part of struggle in the Philippines. It's not a final solution, no final solutions, but these are experiments in community and finance, which I think are very interesting.
All right, we're continuing to hope that the participant can expand on their question about where counterfeit kind of fits into this whole discussion. Next question, what might it mean to decolonize money, Professor? What does that look like?
Yeah, that is the question, right? And that's something that I'm really struggling with. To me, the process of colonization, which I tried to explain, which is really the capture, the extraction of the various domains of the common, of the social, of the indigenous, of the land. That's the problem, which I think I'm trying to address in my phraseology. Decolonization simply put would mean the beginning of the reversal of that, but that's absolutely not an adequate answer. The reason I'm hesitant to provide that answer is because I really think that comes completely out of the struggles for decolonization, which people are engaging in planet-wide, right? Whether it's indigenous peoples in the Americas, whether it's people who have been colonized by Europe, in Africa and Latin America, Southeast Asia, there are struggles going on which have their own agendas. And those agendas can express themselves right now, but they express themselves as anything from political treaties to philosophy books to artworks to shouts in the street. My problem is that the economic media take these things as content provisioning, right? They actually convert these revolutionary gestures and articulations and utterances towards liberation and decolonization. They convert them back into capital. So what we need is decolonizing economic media means that the values that are expressed by people who are oppressed and in struggle persist in the economy in a sustainable way. They don't get subsumed in the economy. They actually persist and begin to articulate the terms of valuation for the next layer. That's really the challenge. It's very hard to even say that for me, but that's kind of what I'm searching towards.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you to the participant. They have now had time to expand. Where would one place the counterfeit within colonization, meaning counterfeit monies, images, attributions, etc.? Is it a method that can work as a medium against white colonial capital? Having trouble explaining. Well, no, I think you did fine. I think maybe the professor might have a better idea what the question is trying to get at.
One more time? Sorry. Can I hear it once more?
Yes. What they were referring to is counterfeit monies, images, attributions, etc. Is it a method that can work as a medium against white colonial capitalism or white colonial capital?
Yeah, so somebody like Max Haven has written about some of the stuff like counterfeiting money or marking money in order to use it precisely as an expressive medium and transform something that's just in circulation among strangers into a testament, really, of an alternative existence and an alternative sensibility. So these things are very, very powerful. This is kind of what I have in mind. All these monies that I'm talking about aren't technically counterfeit, right? They're not real money. They're not legal tender. These cryptocurrencies, that's been the huge debate among the SEC and the financiers. Is this stuff real or not? How real is it? How legal is it? So in as much as they already express dissensus with the current financial system, they're interesting. But to me, the really interesting stuff is the expression that comes, as I said, from subalternity, from the futures which are silenced, and from the kind of utopias which we harbor but somehow don't find expression. So counterfeit, I mean, other writing on money, writing with money, money as art, creating fake monies which are not part of states. To me, that's a very, very significant strategy for thinking about what it is that we might be up to. I haven't exhausted that question. It's a very interesting one. If the contributor wants to say something more, I'm totally happy to hear it. You're muted, Gary, sorry.
I cannot believe I did that. Bad, Gary. Yes, and if the caller or the participant wants to expand some more, we do certainly invite that. I'll acknowledge this is an unfair question. Is it possible that those that have dumped money into the cryptocurrencies could lose every source that they put into that option?
I mean, you know, it's within the realm of possibility. I don't know how likely it is. Like I said, I think crypto's here to stay. I mean, whether the valuation of the entire enterprise should be 1 trillion or 3 trillion or 10 trillion, I mean, nobody knows. And which are the best bets? That's also, I think, completely unclear, which is why there's so much volatility. So could it all go to zero? I'd say that's super unlikely. Okay. But not, yeah, nothing's impossible. We could all go to zero.
Yeah. And I wasn't asking personally. I don't have a dime of money in crypto, but it just kind of struck me, you know, since it's pretty unstable, at least as we speak right now. Should monetary transactions be tied to an identity or be pseudonymous? And what are the cost benefits of such a system?
That's that's again one of those things. I mean, I don't think there's one best policy on that. I mean, it depends upon like the kinds of, if we're talking about community monies, which are also expressive of the values of the communities, and I think there'd be different decisions among different people, right? So if a community decided that anonymity was its most important value, then for sure, use a crypto which cannot be traced and whose transactions can be mathematically hidden, even though they can be validated. But some people, would want to connect their financial expression with their artistic expression in the most direct way. So that would not, so anonymity would not serve. Again, I think there's not a single answer to any of these questions. I think we have a space of experimentation and play. Like there's no one best way to make a painting.
All right, Professor, I think we've exhausted our questions. I'll ask you whether or not you have any final words for our audience tonight before we tell them the programs that are on tap up next ahead of us.
No, I just want to thank everybody for hanging out, and also to encourage people to begin experimenting with these things. We really need to to experiment from the progressive cultural side with finance, because if we don't, we know who's going to be doing it. So thank you.
Well,
thanks, Gary, also for everything.
Yeah, you bet. And let me check one more just to see. Oh, those are just individuals who are thanking you for the presentation. I wanted to be sure that we didn't leave any questions on the table. Professor Beller, Professor of Humanities and Media Studies, and the Director of the Graduate Program of Media Studies at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. Thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for sharing your time with us. I learned a lot today, and I'm sure I can say that is the same for those attending this event. I wish you continued success in all you do. Please keep up the great work and keep up the needed commentary, because we'll certainly continue to follow your works. I'd like to highlight the sessions ahead of us. At 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, Ryan Milner and Whitney Phillips will present their new book, You Are Here, a field guide for navigating polarized speech, conspiracy theories, and our polluted media landscape. After that, at 3 p.m. Pacific time and 6 p.m. Eastern, artist, writer, and teacher Jer Thorpe, the author of Living in Data, will be in a conversation with artist, researcher, and educator Rami Ron Morrison. I hope you can attend both those sessions. To everyone who can hear this message, I'm Gary O'Bannon, thanking you again for your participation, and I wish that you and everyone you love to please stay safe and stay well. Have a great afternoon.